I'm Deborah Hensley. You're listening to our ongoing series, Good Lives, Good Lives, a part of Deborah's Social Stimulus. This time, you'll hear from Bill Best, the author of Saving Seeds, Preserving Taste. He is undeniably passionate about the value of saving heirloom seeds for future generations.
Heirloom seeds need to be saved because we need to maintain genetic diversity. The heirlooms typically are much more nutritious and much more tasty, and I might add, as a rule, more disease resistant than the commercial varieties, where so much of that has been bred out in favor of monocropping, developing plants that can be harvested in large fields by machine with one pass, so that the typical bean, for example, and the typical tomato have never been touched by a human hand. They have gone through this mechanical process and have been stored in warehouses, climate control warehouses, and then taken out and gassed to change the color in the case of tomatoes during transportation, which might be actually some months later, and then still expected to have a shelf life of 35 days after they're finally put on the shelf in their very hardened condition, and virtually flavor-free, and in the case of tomatoes, vitamin lycopene-free as well, the things that we have traditionally prized in tomatoes. And when we created our not-for-profit organization, the Sustainable Mountain Agriculture Center, we started advertising ourselves as an antidote to what modern industrial agriculture has become. In 1965, my two brothers in North Carolina and my father also had started growing tomatoes for different co-ops that were coming into existence in western North Carolina at that time. And we're having some success with tomatoes, and I thought that I would grow tomatoes myself here in Kentucky and see what I might be able to do with on a commercial basis, because they would be coming in mostly during my 1 month of vacation from Berea College at that time. And we would go out to our farm. We were living in dormitories at that time, where my wife was dormitory director. But I got some tomato plants of the Rutgers variety, which was a very well-known high-acid canning tomato at that time. And so I grew tomatoes as an experiment. I didn't have any planned method of selling them wholesale, but I was just going to operate by the seat of my pants to do that. Well, in order to get some really good ground high up and where there was less danger of frost, we leased a garden patch about a mile from where our own farm was, which was down in the valley. But to make a long story short, there was a killing frost over most of the area, and in May, and our tomato plants escaped because of the high elevation above a valley. And then we were able to have an excellent crop. And I took a bunch of ripe tomatoes to the old Kentucky Food Store warehouse in Lexington. And the fellow looked at it, the buyer looked at it, the wholesale buyer looked at it, and tasted one, and he said, "These are excellent tomatoes. I'll take all that you have." Well, about 3 or 4 days later, I took several bushels of ripe tomatoes in the back of my old Peugeot station wagon. And he took one look at them, and he got this terrible frown on his face, and he said, "You brought me ripe tomatoes." And I said, "Yes, I did." the ones you tasted last week were ripe and you really liked them. And he said, but I want green tomatoes. And he said, boy, are you ever naive? He says, you're ignorant. He said, I wanted green tomatoes that I could keep in storage until I got ready to send them out to one of my stores. And then I would gas them en route to the store, and that would color them up so that by the time they got there, and then it would be expected to have a very long shelf life. And of course, he was correct on all counts. I was naive and I was ignorant because that was the first time I had ever realized that even back in 1965, most tomatoes being sold commercially in stores had been picked green, had been kept in storage sometimes for months, and were gassed en route to the destination and still expected to have a shelf life of 35 days. And so that, to me, was a real eye-opener. And I decided then that I would not be growing green tomatoes for anybody because I did not want my name associated with poor quality. Not too long after that, in fact, it is 7 or 8 years after that, I became a charter member of the Lexington Farmers Market. I'm the only charter member still selling. That would have been in 73. And then the following year, I started the Brea Market. One of my earliest memories is being in my grandmother's garden, my grandmother Sanford. On Sunday afternoons, we would frequently go there when I was a small child and right on up into high school. But anyhow, when I was very small, I remember being in Grandma Sanford's garden. I remember how orderly it was. I remember the conversations that she was having with my mother. I later became aware that she was passing on the gardening traditions to my mother, who later passed them on to me, as I have passed them on to my own children, and now my grandchildren, and now my great-grandchildren, 2 of them. The tradition that was most important that my grandmother was passing on to my mother was the seed-saving tradition. And then that later was passed on to me. I was cognizant of it as a teenager and up into my early 20s, but I really became aware of it in my late 20s when I became aware of what was happening to the seeds nationwide and worldwide. But early on, I started passing the tradition on to my 2 sons and daughter. And now, in the case of my son, he and his 2 daughters raise beans for our organization to sell across the country and across the world. And my oldest son's youngest child, who is a boy, Brian, has worked with me for 10 years now. He's 22. He started at 12, working with me every summer and continues to work with me. And he knows pretty much as I do right now because he's been at it for such a long time. And I think he goes with me most everywhere I go. He drives for me now to a lot of places, and he hasn't decided on his college major yet. I don't even know whether to suggest that he go into agriculture or not because commercial agriculture hasn't really bought into the idea of heirlooms that much. Most of what I have written about in bean terminology was common knowledge as recently as 50 years ago, and certainly 100 years ago. But if you skip one generation, all is lost. You have to start over from scratch. If I had my way, I would have preschoolers watching seeds germinate and watching plants grow and caring for them all the way through. I would have all schools having gardens, plying up their yards, or in cities, having container gardening. If you have nothing but asphalt, at least you can experience the growing things. I remember my great-grandchildren when I was showing them how to take seeds out of a candy roaster last year and how I would squeeze them out and clean them off a little bit with my fingers and put them out on a newspaper to dry, they were fascinated by that. So I think you have to catch children at the time they're fascinated before they have become hooked into electronics and they see everything as having an electronic birth instead of a biological birth. But I think that has to come about, and I think the earlier we can start them, the better. And I'm very pleased to see my great-grandchildren growing their own gardens already at a very early age. I'm Bill Best. I've literally been associated with farming all of my life. Age 77, farmer, writer, savior of seeds, and historian.
Thanks for listening. For more information, visit Good Lives, Good Lives on our website at deborahsocialstimulus.com.